Earth had said nothing for 197 years. The Council had stopped waiting somewhere around year 80, filed the silence as consent, and moved on to matters that mattered more. Hours ago, Earth had answered. The message came open channel, no encryption, as if it wanted every ship in the Rift corridor to hear it at once. Relketh pressed play again. You chose this war. We chose to end it. The recording ended, and her claw did not move. She sat in the dark of her quarters, the console's light throwing pale blue across her hand. 7 times now. 7 times she had played the same line, and 7 times she had found the same nothing. No tremor, no crack, no hesitation before the hard consonants. A species that had just lost most of its war fleet in a single afternoon should sound afraid. This one did not. That was the wrong part. That was the part she could not put down. She had commanded troop transports through 3 border wars. She had heard defeated commanders beg, threaten, weep, go silent with shock. She had never heard one sound like this, flat, unhurried, already finished with the argument, the way a person sounds when they are simply reporting a fact and not making a case. Her hand hovered over a second file, personal archive. Restricted. She had not opened it in years. She opened it now. You want to know what she found in that second recording? So did she. Long before any of this, before the silence broke, the vote had already happened. The War Council chamber on Zarvan Prime had been carved from the heart of a dead moon, back when the Empire still measured its borders and what it could see with the naked eye. Black stone walls, polished to a mirror shine, ringed by tiered seating for delegates from every conquered and allied world the Empire claimed. The air smelled of ozone and the faint chemical sweetness of the fear suppressants pumped through the vents, a smell so old to the species born here that none of them noticed it anymore. Somewhere above the dais, a light fixture buzzed at a pitch just wrong enough to be annoying, and no one had ever fixed it because no one had ever complained. Overlord Darketh stood at the center of the floor, bronze-scaled and broad, a puckered scar dragging his left eye half shut from a conquest he liked to bring up in conversations that had nothing to do with it. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The motion stands, he said. Sol system, full annexation. The chamber's voting lights flared amber, then locked green, row after row, until the tally hung above the floor in cold projected light. He had been voting against this same motion for as long as most of the delegates in the room had been alive. Today, the room had finally stopped listening to him. Elder Morvith did not raise a hand to speak. She simply stood, and the chamber, quieted the way it always did for her, long survival earned that much, even from those who otherwise ignored her. I was at the first survey, she said. I watched them build shelters out of scrap in 9 days. I watched them bury their dead and go back to work the same afternoon. You are voting to annex a species you have never once observed doing anything but enduring. Enduring is not power, Elder, Darketh said. No, Morvis said. It's worse. A ripple of laughter started somewhere in the upper tiers, quick and dismissive, and died just as fast when Darketh turned his head toward it. No one in this room laughed at Morvith twice. Beside her, a younger delegate from one of the border colonies leaned in and murmured something about sentiment clouding strategy. Morvith did not answer him. She had stopped answering that particular argument a long time ago. She had learned that some people only believed a warning after it had already come true, and by then a warning wasn't a warning anymore. It was a record. She intended, whatever happened, to leave a good one. No one laughed at her words either. No one argued them. The vote had already happened, and words after a vote were just noise, and the Council had never much cared for noise it couldn't act on. Darketh turned to Commander Relketh, seated at his right hand, second in command, in a career built on being reliably unremarkable in exactly the right ways. Draft the ultimatum, full compliance or full engagement. Give them enough time to be afraid and not enough to prepare. Relketh flexed her primary claw once against her thigh, a habit she had never managed to break, and keyed the transmission open. She did not ask how much time counted as enough. She already knew the number he wanted, and it wasn't generous. 3 light years away, in a bunker built into granite beneath a mountain range that no Zarvoni survey had ever mapped correctly. Admiral Jackson Thorne was drinking coffee out of a mug with a chipped rim when the alert came through. He didn't spill it. He set it down carefully, the way a man sets down something he plans to pick back up. Gray had climbed into his temples years ago, and his hands still carried the calloused ridges of a welder's grip from a life he'd left behind before most of the people under his command had been born. He read the ultimatum once, straight through, and then again, slower, the way you read something you already believe but want to be certain you're not imagining. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a logbook. The leather was cracked, the spine broken in 3 places from being opened and closed for longer than he wanted to think about. He turned to a page near the middle. His father's handwriting filled the margin, ink gone the color of weak tea. If they come for the whole of us. Prepare for the whole of us. Thorne closed the logbook. He didn't need to read the rest. He'd had it memorized since he was a boy standing in a shipyard, watching his father weld hull plates for a fleet that officially did not exist, for a war that officially had not started, on the theory that the day it did start would be too late to begin building. He pressed one button on his console, wake the vigil. The order went out in under a second, routed through channels that had sat quiet for so long that one of the relay stations carrying it ran a diagnostic first, unsure the command was real. Captain Hayes appeared on the side screen within the minute, hair still wet from a shower cut short, uniform half-buttoned. Hayes never wasted a word if a shorter one would do. "Confirming full activation, sir." "Full activation," Thorne said. "Everything we've got. Everywhere we hit it. Copy. Waking the yards." Hayes' screen blinked out before Thorne had finished nodding, which was exactly the kind of response Thorne had promoted him for. Somewhere in the dark behind Jupiter's shadow, where nothing should have been building for as long as it had been, the hidden fleet began to come online, hull by hull, like something enormous rolling over in its sleep. Reactor cores that had idled for years spun up into a hum too low for human ears. Shipyards that existed on no public registry opened their doors onto ships with no public names. It was, in its own quiet way, the loudest thing that had happened in the solar system in a very long time, and not one Zarvoni sensor picked up a whisper of it because no one had thought to look for a fleet that officially wasn't there. Lieutenant Sato's voice cut in next on a separate channel, tighter than usual, words clipped down to their bones the way they always got when she was working fast. "Sir, I flagged their fleet movement past the treaty line months ago. Filed it through proper channels. Nobody read the memo until an hour ago. I read it," Thorne said. "I just didn't have anything to answer it with yet." He glanced at the logbook, still lying open on the desk to his father's old handwriting, and closed it slowly. "Now I do. Understood, sir." "It'll take," she paused, doing the math against a countdown that mattered more to her than to anyone listening, "longer than I'd like, and less time than they'll expect. Then we're about even," Thorne said, and it wasn't quite a joke. Recalibrating the platform grid to their entry vectors now, but it was close enough that Sato allowed herself something like the shape of a smile before she cut the feed. Ambassador Patel walked in without knocking, tablet already lit in her hand, gray at the temples like Thorne, but where his calm ran quiet, hers ran on momentum. "They gave us a deadline. I'm not giving them that long to feel comfortable about it." "Draft something," Thorne said. "Already drafting." She sat across from him, thumb moving fast over the tablet's surface, deleting more than she kept. "The trick is length. Too long, it sounds like we're pleading our case. Too short, it sounds like a threat we can't back up. We can back it up. They don't know that yet. That's the whole point of the wording." She read a line aloud, testing its weight in the air. "This is Earth. You have crossed the threshold defined in the old charter." She frowned and struck part of it. "Too much explaining, they don't need the history lesson, they need the consequence." "Give them both," Thorne said. "Just don't apologize for either one." Patel looked up at him for a second, unreadable, and then went back to the tablet. She had worked with Thorne long enough to know that when he said something in that flat, unbothered tone, it wasn't advice. It was already policy, and she was just the one putting it into words that translated cleanly through an alien receiver. Behind her, in the doorway, a junior communications officer hovered with a data slate, clearly wanting to say something and clearly aware that now was not the moment. Thorne caught the look. "Say it, sir, the Vigil Charter. Once we send this, it goes public. All of it. Every signature." The officer swallowed. Some of those governments never told their own people what they signed on to. "That's not our problem to manage today," Thorne said, not unkindly. "It's theirs to answer for tomorrow. Today we send the message we agreed to send when we signed it." The officer nodded once and left. Thorne looked back at Patel, who had already stopped typing and was watching him with an expression that wasn't quite disapproval and wasn't quite agreement either. "You're sure about the tone," she said. "I'm sure they've never heard anyone talk to them like this," Thorne said. "That's the point." Patel exhaled, made one final edit, and turned the tablet so he could read it. He read it twice, the same careful way he'd read the ultimatum, and set it down without changing a word. "Send it," he said. "Open channel. Let everyone hear it at once." 3 light-years away, Relketh's console chimed with an incoming transmission before the deadline had even reached its midpoint. She had expected silence for most of the window, maybe a formal acknowledgement near the end, the kind of nervous, over-explained surrender the Council had received 100 times from 100 other worlds. That was the shape defeat usually took, long, apologetic. Full of conditions offered by a side with none of the leverage to set them. This was not that. She read it once and did not understand why her claw had already pressed hard against her thigh before she'd finished the second line. She read it a second time to be sure she wasn't misreading the tone, because the words themselves were plain enough that a translator couldn't have distorted them. She looked up across the operations deck at Overlord Darketh, still deep in conversation with the fleet logistics officer about pre-positioning ships along the Rift corridor for what he clearly still assumed would be a formality. She read it a third time because some instinct she didn't have a name for told her that this was the kind of message you didn't get to read casually more than twice. It wasn't a surrender. It wasn't even close to the shape of one. A punitive strike against a species too small to matter. He had not seen the reply yet. He didn't know it existed. Relketh stood, the transmission still open on her console, and did not move toward him immediately. She wanted one more moment with it first, not to read it a fourth time, but to sit, briefly, with the strange, cold certainty that had settled into her chest the moment she'd understood what she was looking at. She crossed the deck toward Darketh, the words of the human transmission already forming in her mouth, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Commander Relketh did not know how her overlord was going to react, and that uncertainty. Somewhere behind that certainty was a memory of Elder Morvith's voice from a subcommittee session years ago, a warning Relketh had filed away under noted and never opened again. She had a feeling she was about to open it. More than anything in the message itself was what finally frightened her. Relketh reached him mid-sentence, and Darketh did not appreciate being interrupted mid-sentence by anyone, least of all his own second. "This had better be the compliance order," he said, without turning from the logistics officer. "It isn't." She held the console out. "It's their reply." He read it standing, the way he read everything, upright and unhurried, as if giving a document time to prove itself worth more attention would somehow be a concession. Relketh watched his eyes move down the short block of text. It started low, almost a cough, and then caught in his throat and came out full, and within seconds half the operations deck had turned to look, because Darketh did not laugh in front of subordinates, ever. She had expected his jaw to tighten, she had expected the scar over his eye to pull, the way it did when something displeased him. Instead, he laughed, as a matter of discipline he'd enforced on himself for 187 years. "A species we haven't even bothered to survey properly in 2 centuries is threatening the Zarvoni Empire in writing." He shook his head, and the laugh spread through the deck the way laughter does when it's given permission from the top, officer to officer. "They're threatening us," he said, still amused, handing the console back to her like something he was done with, until it filled the chamber the way the vote's silence had filled it hours before. Relketh did not laugh. She stood there with the console still warm from her own hand and counted, out of some instinct she didn't examine too closely, the seconds it took for the laughter to finally die down on its own. 43. She didn't know why the number mattered. It simply felt like something she should remember. Elder Morvith did not laugh either. She sat very still in her tier, watching the room the way she'd watched it for 4 centuries, and said nothing at all, which by now had become its own kind of statement that nobody in the chamber was listening for. 3 light-years away, Thorne watched the acknowledgement come back, not a reply, just fleet movement, the Zarvoni War Armada pulling into formation along the Rift corridor, exactly where the old Charter's threat assessment models had predicted an aggressor would come from. "Recalibrate the strike formation," Darketh told the logistics officer, still smiling. "Full force into the Rift corridor. Let's see what they actually built behind all that silence." Relketh logged the order. Her claw pressed once against her thigh and did not stop. Back when the people who wrote those models were guessing at a war they hoped would never happen. "They're not slowing down," Sato said. "Full approach vector. They didn't even wait out the deadline. They don't think they need to," Thorne said. Hayes's voice came through clipped and steady. All 40 online, sir. 14,000 platforms report green across the grid. 67 Allied crews confirmed at their stations. Then we're ready before they are, Thorne said, and there was no triumph in it, just the flat satisfaction of a man watching a plan 2 centuries in the making finally do the one thing it was built to do. He didn't order the fleet forward. He let it wait, hidden, calibrated exactly to the entry vectors Sato had spent the last hours refining, and thought about his father's handwriting in the margin of a logbook that had outlived the man who wrote it. Prepare for the whole of us. His father had never lived to see whether the preparation would matter. Thorne intended to be the one who found out. The first Zervoni ships entered the rift corridor in tight formation, confident in a way that only comes from never having lost, and the platform Sato had spent months calibrating woke up around them like a trap closing on something that hadn't known it was inside one. It looked like silence, and then it looked like 14,000 small lights turning on at once, and then it looked like nothing at all. It did not look like a battle at first, because most of what happened in the first minutes happened too fast and too far away for any single observer to describe as anything but static and flame. By the time Relketh reached the tactical display, the numbers scrolling past her were already wrong in a way that made her check the feed twice for corruption. Ships were not just being damaged. They were being erased from the board in clusters, formation by formation, faster than any defensive network should have been able to track that many targets at once. Confirm the feed, Darketh said, no longer smiling. Confirmed, the tactical officer said, voice thin. It's not a malfunction, sir. It's the count. Darketh said nothing for a long moment. Overwhelm the grid before it can adapt. Sir, if the first wave's losses were— Order it, he said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than shouting, because it meant he had already decided the numbers on the board were an anomaly, and not a warning. Relketh watched the scar over his eye pull tight, the tell she'd been waiting for since the laughter started, and felt no satisfaction in finally seeing it, only the same cold certainty from before, deepening. Order the second wave forward, he said. All of it. She had never in her career disobeyed a direct command, and she did not start now. And nothing Relketh said now was going to change that. She gave the order, though some part of her, the part that had counted 43 seconds of laughter and not laughed once herself, already understood that the second wave was not going to fare any better than the first, and that Darketh's certainty was about to cost more than ships. On the human side of the corridor, Hayes read out the numbers as they came in, and even his usually clipped delivery slowed for a second on the first tally. 800 confirmed lost on their side. We're 4 hours in. Our losses? Thorne asked. Light. Grid's holding better than projected. Hayes paused. Sir, they're sending a second wave. Bigger. Let Sato adjust the calibration, Thorne said. They'll try to overwhelm the count. Don't let the grid get greedy, thin formations. Let it pick its targets. Sato's voice cut through, already working before he finished the sentence. Recalibrating now. Give me 6 minutes. You've got 4. Thorne said, not unkindly, and Sato didn't argue, because she'd already assumed as much. Ambassador Patel stood at the edge of the command floor, arms crossed, watching the tactical feed with the particular stillness of someone who had helped write the words that started this and now had to sit with what those words had set in motion. He thought of the logbook in his drawer, of 47 years of a man's handwriting arguing for exactly this kind of preparation, of the 63 words Patel had drafted that morning that were, in their own way. They're not going to stop the second wave, she said quietly. Not really a question. No, Thorne said. Do we want them to? Thorne didn't answer that one right away, more honest than any diplomatic language either of them had used in years. Sometimes understanding needs the numbers to get worse first. By hour 6, Darketh's own flagship had taken damage severe enough that his tactical staff quietly rerouted half its systems without waiting for the order, and by hour 7, we want them to understand, he said finally. Stopping and understanding aren't always the same thing. 400 ships that had entered the corridor with absolute confidence were retreating without having been told to. She could see it in the way the operations deck had gone silent, the same silence that had followed the vote, except this time no one had voted for it, and no one seemed to know whose fault it was. Relketh did not need the tactical display to tell her that, which in her long experience of institutions was usually the moment right before everyone decided it had been someone else's. Sir, she said. Recommend requesting terms. Darketh turned to look at her the way he might look at something that had spoken out of turn in a room where nothing ever spoke out of turn. For a moment she thought he might actually strike her, a thing he had never once done to her in the years she'd served at his side. He didn't. The transmission came 4 minutes later, open channel, the same way the first reply had come, as if Earth had decided this entire war would be conducted in full view of anyone listening, no encryption, no privacy. He turned back to the display instead and said nothing, and that silence frightened her more than anger would have, because anger at least meant he still believed there was something to be angry at. No room for either side to later claim they hadn't understood what had been said. Relketh received it alone at her console before it reached the main display, the operations deck too consumed by damage reports to notice the new signal arriving. Just a plain statement, delivered in the same flat, unhurried voice as the first one, and Relketh found herself doing the same thing she'd done hours ago in her quarters, listening for a tremor that wasn't there, a crack that never came, and finding instead the growing. She played it once through her earpiece, and then, because some instinct told her she would need to remember every word of it exactly, she played it again. This war began with your choice. It ends with our answer. That was all. No demand, no count of the dead, no gloating. Unbearable suspicion that this species had never once, at any point in the last several hours, been afraid. She looked across the deck at Darketh, staring at nothing in particular. The scar over his eye still pulled tight, and understood with sudden, total clarity that whatever came next in this war, it was not going to be decided by anyone still standing in this room. The order came through not from Darketh, but about him. Overlord Darketh is relieved of fleet command. The voice on the emergency channel said, flat and procedural, as if reading a supply manifest, by vote of the surviving War Council. Effective immediately. Relketh heard it standing in the wreck of the flagship's command deck, ash still drifting past the shattered viewport like slow snow. She turned to look at the man the order was about, and found he had already heard it too, and had not moved. On what grounds? He said. Not a question. His translator flattened even that into something toneless. Catastrophic misjudgment, the voice answered. 40 ships lost. 67 allied species now recognized as sovereign under a charter this council was never shown. The vote was unanimous, Overlord. Even the 25 who voted against the war voted for your removal. Darketh said nothing. Relketh watched his hand, the one still gripping the shattered rail, and it did not tremble either. She was beginning to understand that some things simply broke without ever shaking first. 3 systems away, aboard a transport limping home under escort, Elder Morvith received the same news and did not celebrate it. 19 years, I told them, she said to the aide beside her, not looking up from the window. Nobody wants to be right about a thing like this. I would have traded every year of it to be wrong. The aide didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that fit. Back on Zarvan Prime, the council chamber that had voted 387 to 25 for war now sat in a silence that had nothing patient in it at all. The transmission from Earth had already gone out to every species in the sphere exactly as promised, and with it had come the full text of the charter, 47 signatures in all, dated to a year most of the room hadn't been born for. Species that had spent 2 centuries watching Zarvoni fleets pass through their systems unchallenged now had a copy of a document proving humanity had asked them, quietly, decades ago to prepare for exactly this. Most of them had said yes. The council had simply never been told, because the council had never once considered Sol worth watching closely enough to notice 67 separate governments moving in the same direction. Relketh was given a data slate with a physical copy loaded onto it, standard procedure for any officer attached to a defeated command, meant to be filed and forgotten in an archive somewhere. She did not file it. She sat with it in her lap for a long while in a supply corridor that smelled of scorched insulation and read page after page of names she did not recognize, species she had grown up believing were too small or too cautious to matter. She was still reading when a young logistics officer stopped beside her, holding out a ration bar she hadn't asked for. You should eat something, Commander. In a minute, she said, and did not look up. He left it beside her anyway and went on his way, and she sat there a moment longer, turning the ration bar over once in her free hand without opening it, before setting it down and going back to the page. It was such a small, ordinary thing, a ration bar left by a stranger, and she would not remember, later, why she noticed it at all. but some part of her filed it away regardless, the last thoroughly unremarkable moment before the rest of the day stopped being ordinary at all. The human transmission reached every household screen in the Sol system less than an hour after it reached the council chamber. Ambassador Patel's office issued a second, shorter statement to accompany it, addressed not to the Zarvoni but to Earth itself. We did not want this. We were ready for it anyway. That is the whole of what the last 50 years were for. Admiral Thorne watched that second statement broadcast from a chair he still hadn't left, the mug beside him gone cold twice over now. Captain Hayes stood at the doorway rather than his shoulder this time, giving him the kind of distance a person gives someone who has just finished something enormous and doesn't yet know what to do with the quiet after. "Sir," she said eventually, "the Allied crews are asking if they can stand down." "Let them," Thorne said. "Tell them thank you. Tell them we won't forget who answered." He paused, looking at nothing in particular, "and get Lieutenant Sato up here. I want to know how long that threshold sat unread before anyone noticed." 9 months, sir. She flagged it herself. Thorne was quiet for a moment. Then she should be the one who writes the after-action report, not because it's a punishment, because she earned the last word on it. Far across the rift corridor, in the drifting wreck of the flagship that had once carried his certainty as surely as it carried his crew, Darkith stood alone at the shattered rail and watched the stars through the broken hull plating. He had been wrong. Not defeated in the field, not outmaneuvered by a cleverer commander, simply wrong in a way his 187 years had never once prepared him to survive intact. There was no ship to reroute this time, no fallback pattern to reach for. The wrongness itself was the wreckage, and it did not have an edge he could see past. Relkith found him there again, later, the data slate still in her hand. "Sir," she said, "there's a signal request. Elder Morvith. She wants to speak with the surviving command staff before the council reassigns us." Darkith didn't turn. "Tell her I have nothing left to report." "She didn't ask what you'd report," Relkith said. "Then, patch her through," Relkith did, and stepped back to the edge of the deck to give them what privacy a shattered bridge could offer. Though she could still hear every word, and some part of her, the part that had spent 94 years learning to watch instead of speak. She asked whether you'd listen. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Understood that she was meant to hear it, that this too was a kind of record being made, the same way the humans had made theirs. "I'm not calling to gloat," Morvith's voice said, thin with distance and age. "I called because I want to know if you finally understand what he understood." "Who?" Darkith said. "Whoever wrote that charter 48 years ago and knew somehow that this day was coming and prepared for it instead of dreading it." A pause, Stadicky and long. Silence was never surrender, Darkith. Relkith, watching him from the edge of the deck, saw something in the set of his shoulders that had not been there an hour before, something she did not yet have a word for. It was the last patient thing left in a galaxy that stopped being patient with itself a long time ago. Darkith did not answer that, and would not find one for until she was alone in her own quarters 3 days later with 2 recordings and no sleep ahead of her at all. Partition 4 due. 3 days after the wreckage stopped drifting, Relkith sat alone in her assigned quarters and reached for the recording for the first time. She had put it off longer than she meant to. The data slate with the charter still sat on the shelf where she'd left it, unread pages waiting behind the ones she already knew by heart. She poured herself nothing to drink, straightened the same fold in her uniform collar twice without noticing she was doing it, and only then opened the file. The human voice came through flat and even exactly as it had in the chamber. "This war began with your choice. It ends with our answer." She played it again and again. 5 times, 6, listening past the words themselves for the things she was certain had to be there. Anger, maybe. Grief. Some human tremor a translator might have flattened out on the first pass. She found nothing. Just a voice stating a fact the way one might read a coordinate aloud. On the 7th play, she stopped and opened a second file she had been carrying, unopened, since long before any of this began. Elder Morvith, 19 years younger, speaking to a subcommittee that had long since stopped existing. "The Council's arrogance will produce a reckoning. I do not know when. I know only that it will come and that we will have earned every part of it." Relkith had heard that recording once before, in passing, filed it as the complaint of an old woman nobody wanted to argue with, and moved on with her career. She played it now beside the human voice, back to back, twice through, and found that the two of them were in their own way saying the exact same thing. She did not sleep that night. She sat with both recordings finished, and the room gone quiet around her, and understood, for the first time all the way down, that the silence she'd spent a career reading as weakness had never been that at all. Overlord Darketh received his formal reassignment the next morning. No command, no fleet, no seat on the council that had voted him out of it unanimously. Advisory status, a title with no weight left inside it. He read the notice once, standing in a borrowed office that still smelled of someone else's incense, and set it down without comment. He did not rage. He did not petition the vote. 94 years of certainty had simply run out of ground to stand on, and there was nothing underneath it to catch him. No new doctrine, no lesson he reached for aloud. He asked only one thing of the aide who delivered the notice: a copy of the Human Charter, the full text, all 47 names. He read it alone that afternoon, and did not say afterward what he'd found in it. Relkith was summoned to the council chamber a final time before her own reassignment to give formal witness testimony on the engagement. She stood where Morvith had once stood, in the same cold light coming up through the floor, and the room that had laughed for 43 seconds 3 days earlier now sat in a silence that had nothing left to laugh at. "Commander," the presiding elder said, "you served under Overlord Darketh through the engagement. What would you have this council understand?" She had rehearsed nothing. She said what was true. "They did not attack us," she said. "They answered us. There is a difference, and this council spent 197 years refusing to see it. No one laughed. No one argued." Somewhere in the back of the chamber, Elder Morvith, still recovering from the transport home, watched Relketh with something that might have been recognition. The Charter's full text had already reached every household screen in the Sol system, and something in the reading of it had changed the air there too, though no one could have said exactly how. He sat that evening with the logbook open on his desk again, the mug beside it finally washed and set out to dry, and found himself thinking not of the battle, which was already receding into history the way battles do, but of his father. Admiral Thorne read Lieutenant Sato's after-action report the same week, every page of it carrying her name at the top instead of his, exactly as he'd ordered. He signed off on it without a single correction. She had earned the last word, and he let her keep it. Who had written 48 years of quiet patience into 312 pages and never once lived to see whether anyone would need them. "You'd have liked Sato," he said to the empty room, and closed the book. Relketh was given the logbook itself 2 weeks later, a gesture of goodwill from the human delegation, one copy among several sent to every species that had signed the original charter. She had not expected to receive one personally. She held it for a long moment before opening it, running one claw along the cracked spine, feeling the places where the leather had gone soft with age and handling. She turned to page 47. The signatures were there exactly as promised, 47 of them, small and unhurried, names and scripts she recognized, and some she didn't. Every one of them dated to a year when nobody had believed any of it would ever matter. She thought of the ration bar left beside her in a scorched corridor by a stranger who owed her nothing. She thought of Morvith's recording, 19 years old and unheeded. She thought of Darketh reading the charter alone in a borrowed office and saying nothing about what he found there. Silence, all of it, not absence. Patience, worn into paper, and kept quiet until the day it was needed. She closed the logbook. The leather was warm against her palm, warmer than old leather had any right to be, and she sat with it a while longer before setting it on the shelf beside the charter she had already read twice. Somewhere behind her, unremarkable and easy to miss, a new hail came through her comm from Elder Morvith, asking whether the newly reassigned commander might have time one evening soon to talk about what came next for a council that had just learned it could be wrong. Relkith did not answer right away. She looked at the logbook on the shelf, at the fold worn permanently into page 47, and understood that this too would need to be answered honestly, without haste, the way the humans had answered everything else the galaxy chose. Earth finished. She turned off the comm light and left the logbook exactly where it sat. Page 47 still open, the ink still faded, the leather still warm.